could listen to him all day, and you get to listen to a lot of good jazz this week.
He's
For
the
the whole
closing
week.
act on Sunday night.
Is he? Is?
Yeah.
Oh, at Millennium?
Yes.
Far out. Okay, well, we want to welcome to our little room here, not the stage of the Heartland, as you all know, but the little room where we hang out with interesting people doing great things. And welcome Sarah Knieznik.
There you go.
I'm sorry.
No, happy to be here. Thank you.
And Chris Patterson. Welcome to Live from the Heartland.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Chris, you're the Director of Program and Policy at the Institute for Nonviolence in Chicago.
Yes.
And Sarah is with the Illinois Council on Handgun Violence. I don't know your roles just now.
Okay. So yeah, I work for the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, which is the largest, oldest, and most effective organization working at the state level to pass gun safety legislation. At ICHV, my job is to organize the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition. So I'm a community organizer working in the field of gun violence prevention. Our coalition is 180 member organizations all across the state, representing over 300,000 Illinoisans. And of those 180 member organizations, we work to support and collaborate with organizations that are working to reduce gun violence as a domestic violence issue, as a public health issue, as a hate crimes issue, as a policy issue, like my employer, Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, victim and survivor support. But the issue that we're all most urgently focused on right now is supporting our groups and organizations and advocates that are working to reduce everyday gun violence in underserved communities. And Chris from the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago graciously agreed to join me today because his organization is doing some of the best work in that space.
Wow, that's a lot of information. Let me just, before we go to Chris on what you just said, how did you get drawn into this, Sarah,
Okay.
initially?
Sure. About 4 years ago, I started the first Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America local group in the northern suburbs. Today, there are 8 local groups in the northern suburbs and over 6,000 members. And I'd like to just point out that of the 180 member organizations of the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition, we're very proud that Moms Demand Action Illinois is one of them, but they are one of only of 180. So the gun violence prevention movement in Chicago is large, growing, and becoming more effective by the day.
So one of the things that, I guess I'll ask Chris the same question. How did you get involved in coming to the being the Director of Program and Policy at the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago? What brought you there? Same question, I guess.
Yeah, so our executive director, Tinny Gross, came from Providence, Rhode Island, where he was executive director of the Institute for Nonviolence Practice. There, that is happening in Rhode Island, Providence. So he came into the city around 2016 during the Laquan McDonald at a time there was a huge uptick in shootings.
Can I just say this is like the most unexpected place to be mentioning Rhode Island as a place that came to you as recently as this, but go right ahead.
Yeah, it was definitely for the twist of nonviolence and how it applied to gun and gang violence.
Yeah.
So it really had a really good pattern and outcome there, and trying to replicate that here in the city of Chicago, looking at something new. So we started the Institute in 2016 in Austin. We picked Austin primarily because at the time it was leading shootings and homicides, reentry, unemployment for young black men is the largest population of African American residents in the city of Chicago, one of the larger ones. So that's how we got started in the Institute for Nonviolence.
So one of the reasons that our group was looking to make sure we covered this topic again now, of course, is the recent horrific multiple homicide results, the
Mass shootings.
mass shootings, thank you. For us in Chicago, we have what amounts to mass shootings every week almost. In that same week that we had those 2 horrific incidents,
Double mass.
we had the same number of dead around Chicago from gun violence. So how do we make you know, and we also in Chicago have a lot of gun laws on the books, right? What do laws against guns have to do with stopping gun violence, for starters?
Well, a lot of times when people start to debate this issue, those of us on the gun reform side, the side where we would like to promote gun safety through policy and cultural change, normally people, when they're debating us on that issue, they say things like, well, we already have a lot of great gun laws and they're not being enforced, and a gun isn't going to stop someone who really wants to hurt someone. A law isn't going to stop someone.
Right.
I really think that greatly oversimplifies the matter. Gun violence is a very complex problem, and of course, no one, that is sensible thinks that one single law is going to solve the problem. But another thing that I think we often lose sight of is that it is a very complex problem, but all the different types of gun violence are related. And I see time and time again the policy and legislative initiatives that we support through the Coalition and the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence. So often a particular bill may be framed in order to get it passed, right? As something that will end one particular type of gun violence. But what I try to do through the Coalition is really broaden people's understanding so that they realize almost every gun safety law can actually have an effect on reducing different types of gun violence. So, it really highlights how all of the different types of gun violence are connected, and we're really dealing with one issue. So often people think, well, we have a problem with mass shootings in this country. We also have a completely separate problem of everyday gun violence in underserved communities. And one of the main things I try to do is help people see how they're related.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Sorry, but that was really the question. How do you do that?
Okay. Well, I'm a former educator,
Mhm.
so I really find community organizing in the space of gun violence prevention, I really feel like that's what I'm doing. I'm just doing what I've always done. I'm educating adults on a very complex topic, and I'm helping them understand that it's much broader than what they typically see in the media. For example, I've learned from people like Chris so many valuable lessons. One of them that I pass on to the members of my coalition is people think of everyday gun violence in underserved communities as gang related, right? That's really a misleading term. It does not tell us what's really happening,
No.
which is that almost all of the violence that people sometimes wrongly, in my opinion, refer to as gang related begin as intimate partner violence. So what I do is I try to explain how this bill, take the firearm restraining order for example, it is a bill that will go a long way towards keeping guns out of the hands of people who are no longer capable of or eligible to have them. And although it's not the ideal law that will prevent or help reduce everyday gun violence in underserved communities, it will help, right? It's not going to solve the problem entirely, but it will address it in a small way, or a large way, depending on the situation. But you can also take, for example, the gun dealer certification law, which we finally got passed after 16 years of trying in Illinois. That's a bill that directly will reduce the flow of illegal trafficking of firearms into Illinois communities. And most of the illegally trafficked firearms end up in the communities where Chris and his staff are working and complicating the problem that they're trying to solve.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael, you want to follow up?
Well, we also hear about guns coming in from other places in other states.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder how, we're surrounded by Iowa, we got Kentucky, we got Indiana, we got Wisconsin. I'm not sure about the gun laws in all those states, but Indiana does come up. Does that affect the amount of guns that are coming in?
It certainly does. We know for sure, we have evidence to show that 40% of the illegally trafficked firearms that are recovered from crime scenes in Illinois come from Illinois gun dealers.
How much percent?
40%.
Okay.
So the remaining 60%, Michael, you're exactly right, they come from other states. And often, as I said a few minutes ago, when people debate me on this topic and say things like, well, what good will a gun dealer certification law in Illinois do? It won't stop the guns coming in from Indiana. Well, you're absolutely right, but we have to start somewhere.
And let's hope Indiana
Yeah.
wakes up and changes their laws.
Right, and I also a response I often make when people argue that point, well, we don't need gun dealer certification in Illinois because, it won't do anything about the guns coming from Wisconsin or Indiana. I say, well, if the federal licensing law were adequately enforced, then we would not need a supplemental licensing law in the state. And I would prefer that. I would prefer that the federal licensing law be fully implemented, but because the corporate gun lobby has bought and paid for so many congressional leaders over the last generation or two, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is mandated to enforce the federal licensing law, is so purposely underfunded that there's no possible way they can carry out their mandate. So, yes.
Sarah mentioned that one of the main drivers is intimate partner disputes. I don't know if that always means a domestic violence thing, but how do you apply, Chris, the tenets of nonviolent practice to a domestic violence situation so that it doesn't develop into a gun problem?
So using the steps and principles of nonviolence, keying in nonviolence, it really just starts with affording people the opportunity to communicate with one another, gathering that information, reconciling in a way that is fair for both groups, negotiating with dignity. And so, some of the practices we've directly taken nonviolence and applied it to the conflicts that happen in our community. There's a term defined by our partners at also located in Humboldt Park. It's called red flag relationships. And it's really just identifying, and not just domestic violence, but interpersonal violence, right? And so what you don't have is what you were seeing in the early 80s and 90s, gang conflicts over turf wars, and it's not often the case anymore. Right? People are having conflicts that may stem from social media. A lot of times people may have been friends with each other. And so that's, the interpersonal / domestic components lead to so many of the conflicts that we see in the streets.
That's incredible to me. That social media is, completely not taking responsibility for this aspect of their damage, which is widespread in our city.
Well, it seems to have played a major role in the mass shootings we've seen in other places.
Yeah.
It's intriguing to see that beyond those big headline crises, that day in and day out, that's also what's happening in Chicago neighborhoods. Although we've seen the last week or so an upsurge in suburban shootings of all kinds. What do you think is underlying this increased use of guns to settle personal disputes?
I think it's a culture of violence. It's a culture of violence that is so widespread. It's in our, and I'm not blaming video games. It's in almost every aspect of entertainment for the American society, in our news, in our movies, our reality shows. People just love.
What a misnomer.
Yeah, the sex and violence that happens.
But people watch video games around the world, particularly the Pacific Rim. They're huge users of video games, violent video games. You don't see gun shootings in Korea and Japan.
There's also the difference between access, right? And so part of what Sarah was talking about, and we just talked about from out of state and 40% within the state, is that the access that young people in Chicago and nearby suburbs have to guns, plus the culture of violence, leads to obviously making horrific decisions about other people's lives.
Are there any models out there, or a number of models that you together are looking at on how to interrupt this gun violence, or do we have to come up with our own?
So I think there's a lot of models, and one of the hopeful aspects, and I think from a distance, and this is really what Sarah and organizations like ours are working on, is creating a bridge between the distance between the two cities, say in Chicago. Now, in a community such as Austin, there's a 67% reductions in shootings and homicides in the last 2 years.
Say that percentage again, Chris?
67% reductions in shootings in Austin. But the problem is that
There was a lot of shootings that going on.
yeah, well, and it's actually down from last year.
Yeah.
But so that's some of the hope that people such in Austin, they live on, right? They understand that their community is slightly safer than it was last year. But if our folks and our neighbors in Lincoln Park and Wilmette, outside of those areas don't understand that. And if all we're getting is the information we get from news, then it all looks bad.
Right.
Going to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
The reality is, there's organizations such as Community Partnering for Peace, the Institute for Nonviolence, and organizations that we're working with that are doing great work in the communities, keeping the communities safer.
So you asked a little earlier how I educate members of the coalition
Right.
about this issue. Well, one of the things that I do is I try to support the effort that Chris was just describing. Through the coalition, I try to get the word out to people outside of Chicago's underserved communities about the great work that's being done in those communities.
It's part of the reason I love that the two of you are here sitting next to each other.
Well, there's a reason I asked Chris to come. There are lots of people I could have asked, but it's a pretty
Yeah.
symbiotic relationship between his organization and mine.
It seems like that's absolutely necessary in order for us to get to the roots of this issue. And to have a community that understands it, whether or not you live right in the issue or just outside of it.
One of the issues that's really dogged the mayor in her first 100 days is the shootings that we've had every weekend, it seems, during the summer. And she and the police superintendent, Eddie Johnson, announced a new plan this week to concentrate on folks with guns, particularly violators. Are you familiar with the mayor's latest announcement and plan? Do you think that's going to be a useful approach going forward? You mentioned that there has been a reduction so far compared to a couple of years ago. So are some of these efforts beginning to take hold, or is it?
So I'm not familiar with the intricacies of the new plan, but I would
You're
say
forgiven, it's the first week.
Yeah.
No one is.
right. But I would say, I mean, it's way too early to start judging the mayor's actions or accomplishments or not. Right? This is a generational and decades-long struggle that
Amen.
Chicagoans have been going through. And I think we're just constantly looking for a villain, and I think it's a little bit too early to villainize her work. But I would say that on the ground, in communities such as Austin and West Garfield Park, and this is not necessarily an endorsement, but the facts, that at 1 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, her and her detail are out there in Austin, in communities such as Austin, kind of looking at our work and and checking in with us and sitting at tables trying to discuss what it is that we need, what is it that CPD needs in order to become more effective. So I would say that there's a willingness. I think there's a partnership that I have not seen before from mayor's office in past administrations that is bringing hope to some of us who are on the ground.
Good to hear, real good to hear.
Do you see, taking a bigger view, stepping back, do you ever see a shift occurring in the way we interpret the Second Amendment in this country?
Major silence from our two guests who are very, very familiar
No,
with
it just-
handgun violence.
If one of the major issues is
Won't
easy
be.
access to guns, then I look at the cause of that, and it seems to me a misinterpretation of the militia law embedded in the Second Amendment is why we are stuck with this problem.
A lot of people, I think, view the Second Amendment that way. I hesitated a bit when you posed the question just because I've thought about this issue a lot and been asked about it a lot, but it's never been framed in quite that way. What I see happening, and I know this is happening, I've been intensely focused on this issue for 4 years now, and the change in attitudes that have happened just in the last 18 to 24 months have exceeded those of us in the gun safety movement, exceeded our wildest dreams. Like we're seeing a fundamental cultural shift in attitudes on guns. I don't think, and frankly I don't believe in, I don't think we're seeing a shift, and I personally wouldn't want to see a shift where the overriding urge of American society is to eliminate the Second Amendment. I actually support the Second Amendment. I just really strongly believe that anyone who has the right to own a firearm also has the responsibility to do it responsibly. And I think that's something we've so often lost sight of, at least in my adult life. I'm 47 years old. The emphasis in so many issues in our society, in my life, has seemed to be it's my right. I get to do this because it's my right.
Mm.
And I don't think we talk enough, we don't teach our children enough about rights come with responsibilities as well. And I do think we're seeing a really profound cultural shift on that, on what you pose, the question you pose, but from that particular angle. I see a lot more people, gun owners. I'm even meeting with some gun dealers from the north suburbs on a regular basis to talk about ways that we can find common ground to work together to keep guns out of the hands of people who are not responsible enough to have them, right? What we are working for in the Illinois Gun Violence Prevention Coalition, we of course care about policy change. We want to see more good, well-written gun safety laws passed into law, gun safety bills passed into law. But what we really want to see is cultural change, because we cannot rely on changing laws alone. What we're working for is a time when people are responsible with their firearms, whether there is a gun requiring them to be or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll know we've arrived when it is taboo to allow your 3-year-old access to your unsecured firearm.
Jeez Louise, yeah.
Just the way it's taboo to smoke in a hospital today. I remember when it wasn't, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what is just as important is I'm working for the day, our coalition is working for the day, when it is just as taboo and unacceptable for people in fully served, privileged communities to ignore what's happening in underserved communities. And when those two things are taboo, I'll know we've arrived.
Chris,
Wow.
what do you do in the midst of your very hard work to bring hope to your work? What do you do to keep your energy going, to keep
Yeah,
your spirits up?
So self-care among our profession is like super important. And so, you know, we're constantly convening with each other and supporting each other across the city, right? So there's hundreds of outreach staff and case managers who are doing this work. But the idea is just really having opportunities such as this and letting people know that it is not as dark of a day as it was in the past. And, you know, there are extreme efforts being taken to make the city safer. And the idea is, I think it's, when we start having conversations about all the good work that is actually going on, as opposed to kind of being unaware, I think as a society that so much is actually happening that it's not as bad as it was, right? And so educating folks is key, right? Because once we get that word out, but you know, one of the things to add to what Sarah was just saying, I think folks need to wake up before it's in their front yard. And unfortunately, I can talk about two things: recession and heroin, right? And then I would venture to say, you know, I grew up in the Cabrini Green area and impoverished communities for a long time, and a lot of folks didn't think about recession until it hit them. Heroin has been an epidemic in the Black African American community since the 40s, and it didn't become a problem until it started, you know, going into the right communities, right? And so you don't have to fix gun laws simply because it's knocking at your doorstep, right? So you can see it's a pervasive problem. It's starting to spread. It's in communities that it wasn't traditionally in. And so I think, you know, unfortunately, you know, racism is a real thing, right? And so folks don't often think about these things while it's happening to the others. And I would say, like, it's time to wake up and get real and support the initiatives that Sarah has going on and organizations such as this.
Thank you for that answer, Chris.
All
On
your
that-
answers.
On that note, unfortunately, we've run out of time for you all. Chris Patterson, Sarah Kniesnik, sorry, I did that again. Sarah's from the Illinois Council on Handgun Violence. Chris Patterson is the Director of Program and Policy at the Institute for Nonviolence in Chicago. We are looking at a flyer that asks people to push Congress to pass gun safety laws at a rally September 25th in DC. There are buses leaving from St. Sabinus. We'll announce that again as it comes close. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today and to share what you have. Clearly, there's so much more. We'll have you back. And
Happy
stick
to come
around for the
back. Thank
photo.
Okay.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland, 88.7 FM on your dial. We're going to come back with Twin Peaks, and to get you ready for that, we're going to play something from their upcoming, or, well,
Play it
one
to
of
me.
their albums, yes.